My name is Sarah, I'm 28 years old, and for most of my life, I believed I was the problem child in my family. While my parents spent thousands of dollars on therapy for my older brother Jake, they told me my depression was just me being dramatic and seeking attention. But what I discovered about what they were really hiding behind their treatment of me changed everything I thought I knew about my family and showed me exactly why they needed to keep me feeling small and broken. If you've ever felt like the forgotten child in your family, or if you've been told your mental health struggles aren't real while watching others get the support you desperately needed, this story is going to resonate with you in ways that might be painful but ultimately healing. Because sometimes the very people who are supposed to protect us are the ones who need us to stay wounded. Growing up, my brother Jake was 3 years older than me and what you might call the golden child. He was charming, outgoing, and had this way of making our parents laugh that I never seemed to master. From the time I was little, I noticed how differently we were treated, but I internalized it as something being wrong with me rather than something being wrong with the system. When Jake was 15 and I was 12, he started having what my parents called behavioral issues. He was getting into fights at school, his grades were dropping, and he had these explosive anger episodes at home that would leave everyone walking on eggshells for days. My parents immediately sprang into action. They found him a therapist, not just any therapist, but Dr. Mitchell, who charged $200 per session and was considered one of the best adolescent psychologists in our area. Every Thursday at 4 o'clock, my mother would drive Jake to his appointment. She would sit in the waiting room with a book, and afterward, they would often stop for dinner at his favorite restaurant as what she called a reward for doing the hard work of therapy. I remember feeling a strange mixture of jealousy and confusion about these weekly rituals. When I asked my mother why Jake got to go to a special doctor, she explained that he was going through a difficult time and needed extra support. What I didn't understand then was that my own difficult time was already beginning, but it looked different than Jake's, so it didn't count. By the time I was 14, I was experiencing what I now recognize as classic symptoms of depression. I was sleeping too much, had no energy for activities I used to enjoy, felt hopeless about the future, and had thoughts about not wanting to be alive anymore. But where Jake's problems were external and visible, the fights, the failing grades, the dramatic outbursts, mine were internal and easy to dismiss. When I tried to talk to my parents about how I was feeling, the responses were immediate and devastating. My mother would tell me that I was too young to be depressed, that I had nothing to be sad about, and that I needed to stop being so negative all the time. My father's approach was to tell me that I was seeking attention, and that if I really wanted to feel better, I should try harder in school and stop moping around the house. The contrast was striking. Jake could punch a hole in the wall during one of his episodes, and my parents would have a calm discussion with him about better ways to express his anger. I could spend 3 days barely able to get out of bed, and my parents would accuse me of being lazy and dramatic. This pattern continued throughout high school. Jake's therapy sessions became a family institution. By his senior year, he was seeing Dr. Mitchell twice a week, and my parents had also enrolled him in a specialized program for teens with anger management issues that cost an additional $300 per month. They never once complained about the expense or questioned whether he really needed all this support. Meanwhile, my depression was getting worse. I was having panic attacks before school, my grades were suffering, and I had developed some self-destructive behaviors that I was desperately trying to hide. When I finally worked up the courage to ask my parents if I could also see a therapist, the response was swift and crushing. My mother sat me down in the kitchen and explained that therapy was expensive and that our family couldn't afford to send both children to counseling. She said that Jake's problems were more serious than mine because they were affecting other people, while my sadness was something I could control if I just tried harder. She suggested that instead of therapy, I should try journaling, exercising more, and maybe joining some school activities to make more friends. The message was clear. Jake's mental health was a legitimate medical concern, worthy of professional intervention and significant financial investment. My mental health was a character flaw that I needed to fix on my own. What made this particularly painful was watching how Jake's therapy seemed to be working. His anger episodes became less frequent, his grades improved, and he developed better coping strategies. He would sometimes share insights from his sessions at dinner, and my parents would nod approvingly and praise him for his emotional growth. I found myself both happy for his progress and devastated that I would never be given the same opportunity to heal. The financial aspect was especially confusing because my parents weren't struggling financially. My father had a stable job as an engineer, my mother worked part-time as a dental hygienist, and we lived in a nice house in a good neighborhood. They could afford family vacations, new cars every few years, and plenty of other expenses that seemed less critical than mental health care for their daughter. During my junior year of high school, things reached a breaking point. I was having daily panic attacks, my grades had dropped to barely passing, and I was engaging in self-harm behaviors that I was terrified my parents would discover. I made one more desperate attempt to get help, this time approaching my father privately and explaining exactly what I was experiencing. His response was to tell me that I was being manipulative and that threatening to hurt myself was a form of emotional blackmail. He said that if I was really depressed, I wouldn't be able to function at all, and since I was still going to school and doing my chores, I was obviously fine. He warned me that if I kept talking about suicide, he would have to consider whether I was safe to live at home. That conversation taught me that not only was my mental health not a priority for my family, but expressing my struggles could actually put my housing security at risk. I learned to suffer in silence. College provided some relief from the family dynamics, but the damage was already done. I struggled through my freshman year with untreated depression and anxiety, barely managing to keep my grades up while watching my classmates who had supportive families thrive. I finally accessed counseling through my university's health center, but the limited sessions and high caseloads meant I could only scratch the surface of what I needed to address. Meanwhile, Jake was flourishing. He had graduated high school successfully, largely thanks to the years of therapy and support he had received. He went to a good college, where my parents paid for him to continue seeing a therapist through his undergraduate years. They were proud of his emotional intelligence and often credited his therapy with helping him become such a well-adjusted young man. The irony wasn't lost on me. The child who had received thousands of dollars worth of mental health support was succeeding, while the child who had been denied that same support was struggling. But instead of recognizing the connection, my parents used Jake's success as evidence that their approach had been correct. In their minds, Jake had needed help and had used it well, while I had just needed to mature and learn to handle my problems independently. After college, I moved to a different city and began the long process of healing myself. With my own health insurance and income, I finally had access to the therapy I had needed for years. It was during this process that I began to understand the full scope of what had happened in my family and to recognize the patterns of favoritism and emotional neglect that had shaped my childhood. My therapist, Dr. Rodriguez, helped me see that my parents' treatment of my mental health hadn't been random or accidental. It had been part of a larger pattern of how they related to their children, with Jake positioned as the valuable child whose problems deserved investment and attention, and me positioned as the expendable child whose problems were inconvenient and costly. This realization was both devastating and liberating. It meant that my years of wondering what was wrong with me had been based on a false premise. There wasn't something inherently less worthy about my struggles. There was something wrong with how my family had chosen to respond to them. For several years, I focused on my own healing while maintaining minimal contact with my family. I visited for major holidays, kept conversations surface level, and built a life that didn't depend on their approval or support. I was working as a marketing coordinator, had developed healthy relationships, and was managing my mental health with therapy and medication. Then, last spring, something happened that changed everything. I received a call from my mother asking if I would be willing to help with a family financial emergency. Jake, now 31 and working as a sales manager, had been struggling with what she described as a recurrence of his old problems. He had been fired from his job for anger management issues, was going through an expensive divorce, and had accumulated significant credit card debt. My parents had been helping him financially, but they were reaching the limits of what they could afford. The amount they were asking me to contribute was staggering, $15,000 to help cover Jake's legal fees, therapy costs, and living expenses while he got back on his feet. My mother explained that as a family, we all needed to pull together to support Jake during this difficult time. I was stunned. The same parents who had told me they couldn't afford therapy for me were asking me to contribute $15,000 to continue funding my brother's mental health treatment and legal problems. The same parents who had said my depression wasn't serious enough to warrant professional help were asking me to subsidize my brother's third round of intensive therapy. But what happened next revealed something even more shocking than their hypocrisy. When I asked for more details about Jake's situation, my mother reluctantly admitted that this wasn't the first time they had asked family members for money to support him. She revealed that over the past 10 years, they had borrowed money from both sets of grandparents, taken out a second mortgage on their house, and even borrowed against my father's retirement account to pay for Jake's various crises and treatments. The total amount they had spent on Jake's mental health, legal issues, and financial emergencies over the past 15 years was close to $150,000. $150,000. I sat in my apartment processing this information, thinking about all the times I had been told that therapy was too expensive, that I needed to handle my problems on my own, that our family couldn't afford mental health treatment for both children. They had found ways to access $150,000 for Jake's problems, but couldn't manage $200 a month for mine. The conversation took an even more disturbing turn when my mother began trying to justify their decision. She explained that Jake's problems had always been more severe than mine, that he had needed professional help while I had just needed to grow up, and that as the older child, he had more potential that was worth investing in. But then she said something that revealed the real reason for their treatment of me. She told me that they had always known I was resilient and capable of figuring things out on my own, while Jake had needed more support because he wasn't as naturally strong as I was. In that moment, I realized that my parents hadn't failed to recognize my depression and anxiety. They had recognized it and decided that it wasn't their problem to solve. They had seen my resilience and determined that they could rely on me to heal myself while investing their resources in Jake, who they saw as less capable of independent recovery. I had been denied mental health care not because my problems weren't real, but because my parents believed I was strong enough to survive without support. They had systematically underinvested in my well-being because they assumed I would be fine regardless of what they did or didn't do for me. This realization was devastating, but it was also clarifying. It explained so many patterns from my childhood, why my achievements were minimized while Jake's were celebrated, why my struggles were dismissed while his were met with immediate intervention, why I was expected to be self-sufficient while he was allowed to depend on family support well into adulthood. They had essentially decided that I was the family's emotional caretaker and Jake was the family's emotional patient. My role was to be strong and independent so that they could focus their energy and resources on him. My role was to succeed despite neglect so that they could feel good about their parenting while investing everything in their more fragile child. I told my mother I needed time to think about their request for money. Over the next week, I did extensive research into the therapy programs and treatments they had purchased for Jake over the years. I discovered that many of the most expensive interventions had been optional or luxury services, things like executive coaching, life coaching, and high-end retreat programs that went far beyond basic mental health care. Meanwhile, the therapy I had been told was too expensive would have cost less than $2,000 per year during my teenage years when I needed it most. The total cost of treating my depression and anxiety from age 14 to 18 would have been less than they spent on Jake's optional wellness retreats in a single year. I also discovered something else during my research. Jake had been telling people that our parents had paid for therapy for both of their children, and that I had simply chosen not to continue with treatment after high school. He had been presenting himself as the success story of family mental health investment, while portraying me as someone who had given up on self-improvement. This discovery was the final piece of the puzzle. Not only had my parents denied me mental health care while spending extravagantly on Jake's treatment, but they had allowed him to rewrite history in a way that made my lack of support look like my own choice. When I called my mother back, I was prepared for a conversation that would change our relationship forever. I told her that I would not be contributing money to Jake's current crisis and that I needed her to understand why. I explained that I had spent years in therapy as an adult, addressing the depression and anxiety that had been dismissed during my teenage years, and that I now understood how their differential treatment had affected my development and self-worth. I told her about the research I had done into the costs of the treatments they had claimed they couldn't afford for me, and pointed out that they had spent more on Jake's optional wellness programs than it would have cost to provide me with basic mental health care during my adolescence. My mother's response was to become defensive and angry. She accused me of being resentful and holding grudges, and insisted that they had done the best they could with the resources they had. She said that I was being unfair to compare my situation to Jake's because his problems had been different and more urgent than mine. When I pointed out that they had somehow found $150,000 for Jake's problems but couldn't find $2,000 for mine, she became quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that revealed just how deep the favoritism had run. She told me that they had always assumed I would be successful regardless of what they did, so they had focused their energy on Jake because he needed more help. She actually said it out loud. They had neglected my mental health because they assumed I was strong enough to handle it alone. I told my mother that I needed time to process this conversation and that I would be limiting contact with the family while I figured out how to move forward. I explained that I wasn't angry about Jake receiving support. I was angry about being systematically denied the same support based on the assumption that I didn't need or deserve it. A few weeks later, my father called to try a different approach. He offered to pay for me to see a therapist now, as if addressing my mental health 28 could somehow make up for denying it when I was 14. He suggested that we could call it even if they provided me with some therapy sessions to help me work through my resentment about the past. The offer was so tone-deaf that I almost laughed. They were offering to pay for therapy to help me get over being denied therapy, while still refusing to acknowledge that their original decision had been wrong. They wanted to invest in my mental health now, but only to the extent that it would make me more willing to invest in Jake's continued crises. I declined the offer and explained that I had already taken responsibility for my own mental health care, and that what I needed from them wasn't belated therapy funding, but acknowledgement that their treatment of me had been unfair and harmful. This conversation led to a family meeting that included Jake, my parents, and me. The meeting was supposed to be an opportunity for us to work through our communication issues and find a way forward as a family. What actually happened was that I was confronted with 15 years of gaslighting and reality distortion that had been carefully constructed to protect Jake's position as the family's priority. Jake insisted that he had never known that I was struggling with mental health issues during our teenage years, and that if our parents had known how serious my depression was, they would have gotten me help too. He claimed that I had hidden my problems so well that nobody realized I needed support. My parents nodded along with this version of events, despite the fact that I had explicitly asked for therapy multiple times and had been refused. They had somehow convinced themselves that my direct requests for mental health care had been too subtle to understand, while Jake's behavioral problems had been clear and obvious signals that needed immediate intervention. When I reminded them of specific conversations where I had asked for therapy and been told it was too expensive, they claimed not to remember those discussions. When I pointed out that they had found money for countless expensive treatments for Jake, they insisted that his situation had been different and more urgent. The most painful part of this meeting was watching my entire family work together to rewrite history in a way that protected Jake's image as the justified recipient of family resources, while casting me as someone who had simply failed to communicate her needs effectively. But then something happened that I hadn't expected. My Aunt Karen, my mother's sister, had been visiting that week and overheard parts of our family meeting. After Jake and my parents had finished presenting their revised version of events, she asked if she could share her perspective as someone who had observed our family dynamics from the outside. What my aunt said next validated every feeling I had carried for years and exposed the reality that my family had been trying so hard to hide. She told us that she had been concerned about my well-being since I was in middle school and had actually approached my mother multiple times to suggest that I might need professional support. She reminded my mother of specific conversations where she had pointed out my obvious signs of depression and anxiety, and where my mother had dismissed these concerns by saying that I was just going through a phase. My aunt also revealed that she had offered to pay for therapy for me herself when I was 16, after witnessing one of my panic attacks during a family gathering. My mother had refused this offer, saying that therapy would just make me more focused on my problems and that I needed to learn to cope independently. The room went completely silent as my aunt continued sharing her observations. She described watching our family's differential treatment of Jake and me over the years, and her growing concern about the message this was sending to both children. She talked about how she had seen my resilience and strength, but had also recognized that these qualities were being taken advantage of rather than nurtured. Most devastatingly, she revealed that other family members had also noticed the favoritism and had discussed it among themselves. She said that everyone could see how much I was struggling during my teenage years, and that several relatives had been puzzled by my parents' refusal to get me help while investing so heavily in Jake's treatment. My parents sat in stunned silence as my aunt methodically dismantled their revisionist narrative. There was no way to claim that my problems had been invisible or that my requests for help had been too subtle when multiple family members had observed and discussed my obvious need for support. Jake's reaction was perhaps the most telling. Instead of expressing concern about learning that I had been struggling for years without support, he became angry that the family meeting had turned into what he called an attack on our parents' parenting. He accused my aunt of stirring up old drama and suggested that everyone was ganging up on our parents unfairly. His response revealed something crucial. Jake had always known that he was receiving preferential treatment, and he was invested in maintaining that dynamic. The thought of our parents being criticized for their differential treatment of us was more upsetting to him than learning that I had suffered unnecessarily for years. The meeting ended with my parents promising to think about what my aunt had shared, and with Jake storming out angrily. But the damage to their carefully constructed narrative had been done. There were now too many witnesses to the reality of our family dynamics for them to continue gaslighting me about what had happened. Over the next few months, something interesting began to happen. Word spread through our extended family about the conversation we had all shared, and several relatives reached out to me independently to share their own observations about how I had been treated growing up. My grandmother on my father's side told me that she had always been proud of my resilience, but worried that I was being expected to be too mature for my age. My uncle mentioned that he had noticed how my achievements were minimized while Jake's were celebrated, and had wondered if I felt overlooked. Even family friends began reaching out to share memories of my teenage years that confirmed what I had experienced. My mother's best friend told me that she had been concerned about my obvious anxiety and had asked my mother about getting me help, only to be told that I was just a dramatic teenager who needed to toughen up. The validation from these conversations was overwhelming. For years, I had wondered if I was being too sensitive or holding unreasonable grudges. Learning that multiple adults had observed and been concerned about my treatment confirmed that my perceptions had been accurate. But the most significant validation came from an unexpected source, my former high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, whom I ran into at a coffee shop during a visit home. Mrs. Patterson remembered me clearly and asked how I was doing. When I mentioned that I had struggled with anxiety and depression during high school, she nodded sadly and told me something that shocked me. She said that she had called my parents multiple times during my junior and senior years to suggest that I might benefit from counseling. She had been concerned about my obvious anxiety, my declining grades, and what she described as my general aura of sadness. Each time she called, my parents had thanked her for her concern, but assured her that they were handling the situation at home. Mrs. Patterson had assumed that meant they were getting me professional help. She was horrified to learn that I had never received any mental health support during high school, and that my parents had essentially dismissed her professional recommendation that I needed counseling. This conversation revealed that my parents hadn't just failed to recognize my need for therapy, they had actively ignored professional recommendations that I receive mental health care. They had been explicitly told by a school counselor that I was showing signs of serious emotional distress, and they had chosen to disregard that guidance while continuing to invest thousands of dollars in Jake's treatment. Armed with this new information, I decided to have one final conversation with my parents about our relationship and their treatment of my mental health needs. I called my mother and asked her to meet me for coffee, telling her that I had some things I needed to share. When we sat down together, I explained what Mrs. Patterson had told me about their conversations during my high school years. My mother's face went white as I described how the school counselor had repeatedly recommended therapy for me, and how my parents had led her to believe they were addressing my mental health needs at home. There was no way to deny or minimize this information. It was documented professional guidance that they had chosen to ignore. For the first time in our relationship, my mother broke down and admitted that they had made mistakes in how they handled my mental health. She said that they had been so focused on Jake's dramatic behavioral problems that they had convinced themselves my quieter struggles weren't as serious. But then she said something that revealed the deeper issue. She admitted that they had been afraid that if they acknowledged how serious my depression was, they would have to admit that their family wasn't as healthy and functional as they wanted to believe. Jake's anger and behavioral problems could be explained as individual issues that required individual solutions. My depression and anxiety, on the other hand, might have forced them to examine whether there were problems with the family system itself. She told me that it had been easier to treat my mental health concerns as character issues that I could overcome with maturity than to consider whether the way they were parenting both of their children might be contributing to my struggles. This admission was both heartbreaking and infuriating. My mental health had been sacrificed not just to preserve resources for Jake, but to protect my parents' self-image as good parents who had created a healthy family environment. I told my mother that I appreciated her honesty, but that I needed her to understand the full impact of their decisions. I explained that I had spent thousands of dollars and years of my adult life addressing mental health issues that could have been treated much more effectively during my adolescence. I also told her about the career opportunities I had missed, the relationships I had struggled with, and the general diminished quality of life I had experienced because of untreated depression and anxiety throughout my late teens and early 20s. But most importantly, I explained how their differential treatment had affected my sense of self-worth and my ability to advocate for my own needs. I had learned to expect that my problems wouldn't be taken seriously, that my struggles weren't worth investing in, and that my role in relationships was to be strong and independent while others received care and support. My mother listened to all of this with tears in her eyes, and for a moment I thought we might actually be able to repair our relationship based on this new level of honesty and accountability. But then she asked me what I wanted her to do about the situation now, and I realized that even her admission of wrongdoing was coming with an expectation that I would provide a simple solution that would allow our family to move forward without further discomfort. I told her that what I needed was not a quick fix, but a fundamental change in how our family operated. I explained that I could no longer participate in family dynamics that positioned me as the strong, independent child who didn't need support, while Jake continued to be treated as someone whose problems deserved immediate family intervention. I said that if Jake was going through another crisis and needed financial help, that was between him and our parents. But I would not be contributing money to support someone who had received 15 years of preferential treatment while I was expected to handle my own problems independently. I also told her that I needed to see evidence that they understood the seriousness of what they had done before I could consider rebuilding our relationship. This meant acknowledging their mistakes to other family members, making amends for the years of dismissal and neglect, and demonstrating through their actions that they valued my well-being as much as they valued Jake's. My mother became defensive again at this point, saying that I was asking too much and that she couldn't change the past. She suggested that we should focus on moving forward rather than dwelling on old grievances. But I had learned enough about healthy relationships through my own therapy to recognize this response as another form of manipulation. She wanted the relief of confession without the responsibility of making meaningful changes. I told my mother that I would be taking an extended break from family contact while I continued to work on my own healing. I explained that I loved her and wanted to have a relationship with her, but that it would need to be based on mutual respect and acknowledgement of reality rather than on my continued acceptance of being treated as less important than Jake. That conversation was 6 months ago, and it marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. I have had minimal contact with my parents since then, and no contact at all with Jake, who has made it clear that he views my boundary setting as a betrayal of family loyalty. The extended family has largely split into two camps, those who support my decision to demand accountability and those who think I should forgive and forget for the sake of family unity. This division has been painful, but also clarifying. It has shown me who in my family is capable of acknowledging uncomfortable truths and who is invested in maintaining dysfunction for the sake of avoiding conflict. My Aunt Karen has become an unexpected ally and source of support. She has told me repeatedly that she wishes she had intervened more forcefully when I was younger, and she has been working on her own boundary setting with family members who enabled my parents' treatment of me. Through therapy, I have come to understand that my experience is unfortunately common among families with multiple children. Many parents, often unconsciously, assign different roles to their children based on their personalities and perceived capabilities. The strong, resilient child becomes the family's emotional caretaker and is expected to succeed without support, while the more obviously struggling child receives attention and resources. This dynamic is particularly damaging because it teaches the resilient child that their worth is conditional on their ability to be strong and independent, while teaching the struggling child that their needs will be met through displays of crisis and dysfunction. My therapist has helped me see that my parents' treatment of me wasn't really about money or resources. It was about their need to maintain a family system where they could feel successful as parents. Jake's dramatic problems gave them opportunities to intervene heroically and feel needed, while my quieter struggles threatened their sense of competence and control. Acknowledging that I needed help would have required them to examine whether they were creating conditions that contributed to my depression and anxiety. It was easier to reframe my mental health concerns as character issues that I could resolve independently than to consider whether their parenting approach might need adjustment. This understanding has been both liberating and deeply sad. It has freed me from wondering what was wrong with me that made me less deserving of support, but it has also forced me to grieve the family relationships I thought I had. The most surprising outcome of this whole experience has been the positive changes in my own life. Setting boundaries with my family has given me practice in advocating for myself in other relationships. I have become much better at recognizing when people are taking advantage of my resilience and much more willing to demand reciprocity in my relationships. I have also discovered that my strength and independence, which were taken for granted by my family, are actually valued and appreciated by people who care about me genuinely. My friends and romantic partners see these qualities as assets that make me a good partner and friend, rather than as reasons why I don't need their support and care. My career has also flourished as I have become more confident in advocating for myself professionally. I recently received a promotion to marketing director at my company, largely because I have learned to speak up about my contributions and ask for the recognition and compensation I deserve. Most importantly, I have developed a much clearer sense of what healthy relationships look like. I now understand that people who truly care about me will want to support me during difficult times, rather than expecting me to handle everything independently. I have learned to distinguish between people who value my strength and want to add to it, and people who take advantage of my strength and want to drain it. The work of healing from family trauma is ongoing, and there are still days when I feel sad about the relationships I have lost in the process of setting boundaries. But there are many more days when I feel grateful for the clarity and peace that come from living authentically and surrounding myself with people who see my full worth. I still hope that someday my parents will be able to acknowledge the full impact of their choices and work toward making genuine amends. I would love to have healthy relationships with them that are based on mutual respect and care, rather than on my acceptance of being treated as less important than my brother. But I have learned that I cannot force other people to grow or change, and that my well-being cannot depend on their willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. My healing has to be my own responsibility, just as their healing has to be theirs. If you have experienced similar favoritism or neglect within your own family, I want you to know that your perceptions are probably accurate, even if other people try to convince you otherwise. Families often develop elaborate narratives to justify unequal treatment, and the children who receive less support are frequently gaslit into believing that they are being too sensitive or holding unreasonable expectations. You deserve to have your mental health needs taken seriously, regardless of whether you are the family's designated strong child or struggling child. Your worth is not determined by your ability to handle problems independently, and asking for support is not a sign of weakness or failure. The people who truly love you will want to help you during difficult times, rather than expecting you to prove your worthiness by suffering alone. If the people in your life consistently dismiss your struggles while supporting others, that says something about them, not about you. Setting boundaries with family members who have treated you unequally can be one of the most difficult but necessary steps in protecting your mental health. It requires giving up the fantasy of the family you wish you had in order to deal with the reality of the family you actually have. But it also opens up space for building relationships with people who see your full value and want to support your continued growth and healing. Have you experienced favoritism in your family around mental health treatment or other forms of support? Have you been the strong child who was expected to handle everything independently, or have you watched a sibling receive support that was denied to you? I would love to hear your experiences in the comments and continue building a community of people who understand what it's like to heal from these family dynamics. Remember that your mental health matters, your struggles are valid, and you deserve relationships that support your well-being rather than taking advantage of your strength. You are worthy of care and support, and anyone who tells you otherwise is protecting their own interests rather than looking out for yours. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking and subscribing to help reach other people who might need to hear that they are not alone in these experiences. Sometimes the most powerful form of healing is simply knowing that someone else has walked a similar path and found their way to peace and empowerment on the other side.